Hello. In this video I'm going to cover a couple of games of Levon Aronian from the Grand Prix. Levon is one of the contestants for the Grand Prix spot because he was the finalist of the first leg, and now if he gets to the semi-final or final he has plenty of chances to qualify to candidates. And after 4 rounds he was leading, he was on the first place, tied with Hikaru Nakamura, I think. And sorry, no. He was second with Hikaru, but first was Oparin. And in this 5th round, he played against Esipenko with white. And let's see what happened. We had the Nimzo Indian, and it very quickly transposed to Samaragozin, but now Levon plays e3. Queen a4 is here the main move, I think, and the game continues knight c6, I think e3 now, or bishop g5, and the game is entirely different. And he chose to play e3, something similar to what happened against Vidit in the first leg, I think, where he played something similar with the bishop on c1 and pawn on e3. Now Esipenko castles and bishop d2. If I'm not mistaken, this is something similar was played between Hikaru and Esipenko in the first round. And Esipenko goes b6 here. Levon takes on d5 and Esipenko takes back. And now bishop d3. Finishing development and preparing queen c2 and maybe even going for a long castle. He's still flexible, while black took his decision to go for a short castle, which makes him slightly more unflexible than white. Now Esipenko goes for bishop b7, queen c2, and now Esipenko plays rook e8. Preparing c5 at some point and trying to force white to decide where to go, because with c5 next there would be some substantial pressure on the d4, and the king being under pin would have to go away. So first Levon plays a3, and now Esipenko goes back to f8. Here interesting was to capture on c3 to give up the bishop pair and to go immediately knight e4, which would be a good practical chance, I think. Still, white is slightly better because you always, in such positions, c7 pawn is a somewhat weakened pawn, and that's what gives white some slight edge. But Esipenko chose not to give up the bishop pair and he went to f8. But now there are some concrete issues and small unpleasant things that happen. Now Levon plays knight g5. He still doesn't castle on the queen side, and he goes knight g5, which now makes some questions to be answered. What can black do? He needs to defend the h7 pawn, and if he does h6, then there is a mate in 2. Bishop h7, you cannot capture because of queen takes and checkmate, and king h8 doesn't do much because of knight f7 checkmate. So actually in this position black wants to keep the pawn and he plays g6. But usually when you have this structure on the king side, it usually invites white to start putting pressure on g6 even more. And now Levon plays h4, trying to get h5 next, and to somehow open up black's king side. And I think this was the critical moment in the game, where Esipenko had a chance to somehow make things more complicated and keep the game going. And here he played c5, which seems very principled, trying to open up the center while the king is still in the center, and trying to make something like this work. dc5, d4 and tried to open up the position while white tried something on the flank. But actually, instead of c5, it was best to go bishop g7. Just trying to restructure his pieces and to get the bishop to g7 to somehow make this king safer. And probably something that was Esipenko's concern in this position was h5. Because now some sacrifices on g6 are lingering in the position. Let's say if you just ignore this by knight d7, maybe something like takes, and even knight f7 was a threat. Also, bishop takes g6 immediately is not very pleasant. So maybe because of that he was not so pleased, but actually after knight captures, black was probably scared of this, and bishop h7, which seems reasonable because black's king is a bit troubled here. It has to go to f8, and after white castling on the after white castles on the queen side, it's not easy to make the game pleasant anymore. And white can just put his king to safety, open up the king side by moves like g4 or just rook h1, simply collecting the pawn on h5, and make things much more unpleasant than they should be. And also after bishop g7 and h5, if black tries to kick this knight away, hoping for something like this to happen, or at least just knight takes h5, now white doesn't have to get back. He can go forward and take on f7, and if king takes, to take on g6, and now already white has 2 pawns for a piece, and he has the option to take the rook on e8. But what's bad about black's position is that white is not obliged to capture. And after, let's say, king g8, because if king e7, you can just castle and open up with e4, rook he1, and make things much more dangerous. I think that here, after king g8, it's the king is safer, but not in that degree, because again you can go g4 and then castle on the queen side, and again there's this danger of opening up the king side, and this attack might be very dangerous for black. But none of that was played in the game, and like I said, bishop g7 was the best, and allowing this exchange sacrifice on h5 after this. But Esipenko played c5, and now there was h5. Well, now if you capture on h5, this is slightly worse, because after bishop h7 and king g7 has to be played, because now if you go to h8 there is a fork on f7. So you have to go to g7, and the bishop on f8 is useless, and it's a worse version of these things. Even something like knight to f7 comes next, or simply f4 and go for a slow attack. So after this, Esipenko chose h6, after which Levon just took on g6, and things become very dangerous for black after this point. Now Esipenko played principally and he took on g5, but now after g takes, king f7 and bishop g6, now the king has to move towards the center, and he tries to escape towards d6 and c7 somehow to evacuate his king, but it's not so simple, and Levon plays queen f5, continuing this attack and not giving up the bishop, because at this moment the bishop is much more valuable than the rook on e8, since it's covering some very important squares for the black's king. So Esipenko tries to get out. He plays bishop g7 to somehow free his rook, and also potentially to go rook h8 at some point. But now Levon plays e4. He tries to include the bishop into the play to get to g5 and to open up other avenues in this position. And now if black takes on e4, there is bishop takes g5, followed by long castle. And even this attack is looking really, really dangerous for black. Let's say if you go knight bd7, you just castle and you put your rooks on open files, or you also have rook h7 as an option, attacking this bishop, so it's really, really bad for black. And already it feels like white is very close to winning the game. And Esipenko chose to just finish development, knight c6 by him, and this was the moment for Levon to probably finish the game on this, at this moment. He took on e8, which makes Esipenko's defense a bit easier, but he could have played a move bishop g5 very simply. And now it's the knight on f6, which is pinned. So you don't have plenty of good choices here. Plenty of good options. What can you do? If you go back to f8, now you take on e8, and after knight d4, there's bishop f6. And actually white is having the exchange up. In this position, capturing the queen doesn't work because you simply take it, and after this bishop g6, bishop escapes, and there is still this material advantage. So after knight c6, Levon took on e8, and now Esipenko makes one more mistake, and he goes for queen takes. The better choice was king e8, although even this is not going to work out that well for black, but it keeps some game going on. And probably the plan was to go to take on g5, and now if you capture on d4, there is queen g6 check, which is quite unpleasant. And if king f8 to defend the bishop, now there is this nice move, rook h7, using the pin on the queen, attacking the bishop the second time, and if queen e7 is played, now you take on g7 and queen takes bishop h6, and black is losing the queen. Also the game. So after bishop g5, queen d7 is possible, the best move, and this is really tough to continue as an attack. If you go queen g6, there is queen f7 at least, and the game is somewhat complex because in this case white has a rook versus two pieces, which is not so clear. So the best choice for white here is to take on f6, and after exchanging queens, take on d5, bishop d4, and now white can take the exchange, but things are not very simple because after this, we have a very unusual material disbalance because we have three minor pieces against two rooks. But what's in white's favor here is that he has plenty of pawns on the king side, and that's the only thing that makes black's position somewhat unfavorable. Because if these pawns just run, it's impossible to expect something, but black also has an option of somehow dealing with these pawns, stopping these pawns by these pieces. And even though the engine says it's like plus 1.7, 0.8, I think practically speaking this is a very good chance for black to survive because of the bishop pair and also the knight, which can be quite a tricky factor in the position. So I would I would stop here and not analyze too much, because it's really not possible to cover all the possibilities. So yeah, white just has to coordinate his pieces to somehow protect his pawns and to start pushing the pawns, but black also has a fairly simple task. I mean, conceptually simple, but practically maybe not so much. Okay, so after bishop e8, Esipenko took with the queen, and still there is this disbalance. White has a rook against two minor pieces, against bishop and knight. And now Levon takes on d5. His idea is just to open up the position to somehow enable his rooks to get into play. And now, what does black do? He has two options, because he can take on d5, or he can just defend the knight on f6 by king f7. Let's just cover this, because Esipenko took on d5. What's happening now? Well, you take on f6, and if bishop takes, then rook h7 is very strong, capturing the bishop on the next move, so that's not good. Also, if knight takes d4, then knight e8, and again we have the exchange of pieces. After this, knight g7, and white ends up being an exchange up. Also, the g5 pawn hangs, and it's entirely different than what we saw before. So Esipenko chose to take on d5, but now Levon doesn't take on d5 immediately. He takes on g5. And now it's a funny disbalance. 3 minor pieces for a rook. But black's king is so hopeless that it's not possible to use any of these pieces properly. And if black is greedy here and plays knight f6, if he goes back, then just take on f6, take and include the rook to h8. And on the next move, white takes on f6, let's say king d8, queen f6, king c8. You can just go back to f4, defending the e4 pawn and also targeting c7 with a potential mate. And after queen d8, let's say, you take on c5, go rook d1 next, and also you can rely only on the pawn, on the g pawn. And with black being so passive in this position, it's impossible to ask for something from black. It's just impossible to do anything. Rook just goes to d1 or c1, and the g pawn can also push, and it's basically game over. So Esipenko tried with something else. He tried king d6, but now Levon takes, and after king c7 there's a decisive blow, rook h7, pinning the bishop and making things even worse, because now there are threats like bishop f6. If you defend the bishop, if you go like this, then simply take, and bishop f6 with capturing the bishop. And that's why in this position, after rook h7, Esipenko resigned. And with this win, and Hikaru winning in the 5th round against Oparin with white, Hikaru and Aronian were tied on the first place of Group A, and that made things even more interesting for the next round. So in the next round, Aronian was playing with black against Oparin, and it was really an interesting game. So let me show you that as well. Just give me a second to type the names and the round 6. But now Levon's task was much tougher, because he was black and he doesn't know what is Hikaru going to do against Esipenko, and that's a bit tricky about these on-demand games. Okay, now what's happening? Leakage. Okay, so we have this game, and Oparin was a really dangerous opponent in these previous 5 rounds. And he chose to play 1d4. And Levon went for the Queen's Gambit, and Oparin chose a very topical line these days, a very topical variation, the Catalan. After which Levon chose to go for the open Catalan after dc4, bishop g2, and now black has plenty of options like knight c6, c6, bishop e7 just. I think even b5 works. But here he chose to play c5, and usually it leads to some symmetrical structures. Now Oparin castles, and now knight c6. Of course, black has options like cd4, but pardon me, but these structures are slightly more pleasant to white. After cd, knight takes. Eventually c4 pawn gets lost in the process, and white is very pleasant and slightly better because of that. Also because of this bishop on c8, which is always a burning topic of black's position. So he chose to play this line, knight c6. And now it's time to pin the knight and threaten a move like knight e5. So Levon plays bishop d7 to stop knight e5 from happening. Also, there is cd4 even in this case, but after knight e4, there is one interesting line which involves the queen sacrifice after bishop c6, bishop d7, rook d1, queen d1 is there, queen d1 and bishop c6, but it's only playing for one result, and here white can only win, it seems like. So after rook d1, bishop c6 should be played, but after queen c6 and capturing the queen back, it seems like black is again playing for two results only, for a loss or a draw, because eventually c4 pawn gets lost, and these pawns on the queen side are not quite presentable. So he chose a different option here, and he chose bishop d7. Now Oparin takes on b5 and on c4, and now black goes b5. He tries to expand on the queen side with this move, and he's using the fact that queen b5 is not possible since black takes on d4, and when the queen moves to, let's say, c4 or d3, let's say this, there is bishop b5 and e2 pawn is lost on the next move. So after b5, Oparin chose to go back to d3, and now c4. The point of Levon's play here is not to get the symmetrical structure, which would probably peter out to a draw, and he tries to make some disbalance. It's connected to some risk because white has a more central control, but he's trying to outflank on the queen side. The queen goes back to d1, and now rook c8 by Levon. He's trying to support these pawns on the queen side by a potential a5, b4, and to get this c pawn very dangerous. And now Oparin plays bishop f4. His ultimate goal here is to push e4 at some point and to get some control in the center. But now Levon plays h6, which is very interesting. Actually a novelty in this position. h6 is connected with a very dangerous, very risky plan. And usually people... Well, the most natural move here is to play bishop e7 and finish developing by castling. And in case of knight c3 to go queen b6 and just support this pawn. And at the same time to attack the d4 pawn. But he chose a different path and he chose to play h6, trying to challenge the bishop on f4 somehow. Now a3 by white. He tries to stop the pawn advance on the queen side by potential b4 and c3. But by this move he is weakening the light squares on the queen side, like b3. And now I think still it was the time to pull the brakes and go bishop e7 and just continue the normal game, but he played g5, which is objectively a fine move, but a very, very risky one. Bishop goes to d2. Now the king side looks very fragile from black side, and the king would not be very, very happy to castle there, but if it must, let's imagine that the e-file gets opened after the potential e4 d5. Then the king would have to find some refuge on the king side. So Levon plays bishop g7 and he's ready to castle at any moment. Now knight c3 and now a6. I think it's better not to waste time on defending the pawn like this. I think it's better to go queen b6 with double purpose, defending this pawn and attacking the d4 pawn. And probably just force white to go e3, or maybe go e4, but I think after g4 you can go to e1, and I'm not so sure about capturing on d4 now, because in that case there's e5 with jumping all around and also capturing on g4 as well. But also there is a nice idea by knight e4, knight d6, and causing some trouble in black's position. So probably after e4 it's best to just chill and castle on the king side and keep the things more complicated than in the game. So after this, black played a6, and now Oparin chose a very modest move, e3. He's not choosing to play e4, which would be very natural, but it would leave this d4 pawn more exposed. And in case of g4, to kick the knight from defending the pawn, now actually white can do this. And now it's impossible to capture on d4, because in that case, after e5, the knight doesn't have a really good square to go. If it goes to h7, then first bishop f4 and have an idea like knight e4, knight d6, and also attack the knight. So if this happens, you can take on f5 take and go queen d6. Now a6 hangs. As white, you stop castling, so black's king is in so much trouble right now. And I think after knight h4, the best is to go e5 to have an idea like d5, knight e4 with serious counterplay, because the knight can jump all the way to b3 and cause some disturbance in the position. But after e5 you can take, and if takes, to go bishop f4. And then go queen d2 next. If the knight goes to d3, let's say, go here, and in case of capturing, to go queen f4. And even though black is a bishop pair up, it's not easy to make these pieces work. Let's say if you castle, rook fd1, the a6 pawn might become a huge target in the future, especially after e5, bishop b7 ideas, and so on and so on. So e4 was a very interesting option. Nothing of this is forced, but I'm just giving a blueprint of how the things would work out after something concrete like g4. Of course, you don't have to play g4, you can just castle, but that also allows moves like d5 or just bishop e3 with the slow play. Let's say castle, bishop e3, and slowly getting more and more space. So let's go back to the game. Let's go back to this moment, and Oparin played e3, keeping this center very compact. And here, this was the moment maybe to go for knight a5, to head for b3. To make this knight enter white's camp, and to make some disturbance. Let's say if you go knight e5, to go knight b3. And if rook b1, to just castle. And now black is happy, I guess, to exchange the bishop for the knight. But if he doesn't take, if he goes, let's say, for f4 to punish black's kingside excursion with g5, then black can go bishop e8 and make the things more interesting. And in the future, you might move the knight to d7, play f6, and get the bishop out to, let's say, g6 and make things more bearable for himself. But Levon chose to castle, and now knight e5 comes as Oparin's answer. And now there is a question what to do. There is f4 coming next, opening up the kingside, and black has to do something really quickly. I think the best option here was again to go knight a5 with the same idea, to go to b3 and to have some active pieces at least. And if you choose this and this, bishop goes to e8, and we have something similar actually to what we saw before, if not the same. And I think the game would be very interesting from this point on. Both sides have chances for playing for an advantage, so I would not dare to prognose what could happen in this case. Here Levon chose to capture on e5, and now Oparin takes on e5. And he goes back to e8. And this position looks really unfortunate for black, because all of these pieces are so bad, and once the kingside gets opened, it's not gonna be easy for black to coordinate his pieces as he wishes. Now, of course, Oparin plays f4, combining two things, wanting to defend the e5 pawn and also to open up the kingside as soon as possible, to make these pieces, to make the most out of these pieces, which are quite bad. The knight cannot jump to d6 or f6, it has to go to c7, but even then there's no hope for the knight to get to d5, because you have this issue, and Levon is trying somehow very desperately to open up the position by f6, which is quite natural when you have the space deficit, like in this case. For example, if you try something like gf and White takes back and also has options like rook f3, rook g3, which is quite dangerous. When the king goes to h1, you can double on the g file and put enormous pressure on black's king. And after f6, now Oparin plays knight e4, centralizing the knight and also trying to get bishop more active, like with bishop b4 and maximizing all of his pieces. But here, actually, this was the best move, which might seem a bit silly because you release tension from the position, and but the point is really nice. If you take with the f pawn, white can exchange rooks, and after bishop f8 to go queen h5. Now, this threat of queen g6 is quite unpleasant, and the most logical move here to me seems like queen e7. But now the rook comes into play after rook f1, and after trying to regroup with queen g7, there's knight e4. And there are lots of threats here. There are threats like knight f6 on the next move, trying to activate the rook from f6. There's also bishop b4 as a move to exchange bishops to make f6 more approachable. There's also bishop h3 as an option to target e6 even more. So black's position is just simply unattainable at this point. And also, if hg, there is one nice move here, knight d5, which is very nice. Attacking one more time on f6, and the point is after e d5 there is bishop d5, and after king h7, now you don't give a check on h5 straight up. You go bishop b4 first. And now if you do some random thing like, let's say a5, now you give a check. And if bishop h6, bishop f8. That's the point of bishop b4 first. So fg was more dangerous, but even this is a very nice move with a logical purpose, going bishop b4 next, and also trying to dislodge these pawns on the king side to somehow undermine those pawns. And here Levon plays a decisive mistake, I would say. He plays bishop, he plays fe5. And the one thing I didn't mention here was there was a second threat, which was even more dangerous at this point, which Levon didn't see. And if he saw that, he would probably go with bishop c6. But still, the game would be very tough for black, because after bishop b4, after queen trade, let's say rook a d1, rook f7, you can take on f6. And what can black play here? If he goes bishop f6, then takes, knight f6, rook d6, and all these pawns are going to drop pretty soon. And in this case, if you take on e4, first capture on g7, and if bishop g2, king g2, the knight is quite passive, and these pawns are controlled. This pawn majority on the king side, on the queen side, is controlled pretty easily, and with the knight not being able to support these pawns, it's really tough to imagine that he can push these pawns. Because if the knight moves, then there's always danger of rook d6 entering to the 6th rank and targeting these a6 and e6 pawns. So after this, you can take on g5, take it, maybe give a check and then exchange. after rook d7, it's just a very, very bad position for black. And he took on e5. But now the thing that Levon missed was bishop a5, a really nice tactic. And at first you might think, okay, it's just exchanging bishop for bishop, but actually the bishop on d7 is the vital piece, holding everything together, holding every single thing in the position. And the unfortunate part is that you cannot go queen e7 to avoid this because of bishop b4, losing the exchange. So Levon has to capture, but now it's simply over. Queen d7, and now the e6 pawn is under attack, so Levon chose to defend it by knight c7. But now the kingside crumbles. fg, Levon took, and now knight g5. And now white wants to go, among other things, rook f7 and to deliver some crushing attack. And now Levon tries desperately something, tries to play for the kingside attack, tries to take on e3 and then take on g5. So in this case, this would be a terrible, terrible mistake, because after this, king h1, queen g5, now the bishop on g7 is under protection, so white is gonna cry in that case. So that's why Oparin plays very calmly h4, defends the knight, and he doesn't care about this pawn, because in that case king h2 can be played, and rook f7 comes next. So if black tries to exchange queens like this, then he takes on f8 and he uses this move as a deflection, because if the bishop takes, there is checkmate on h7, and if rook takes, then the knight hangs on c7. So yeah, here it's just game over. Levon played rook cd8, but after exchanging rooks and going king h2 preventively to indirectly defend the e3 pawn, because the knight on c7 hangs. Now Levon plays e4, trying to maybe establish some counterplay, but it's impossible because the bishop cannot move, since there is always checkmate on h7. So this was just a formality. Rook d1 was played by Oparin, trying to go rook d6 and trying to use this horrible knight on c7. King h8 by Levon, and now rook d6. Queen b8, now rook c6, and after the knight gets under pressure, the e6 pawn drops and it's all over. The position just collapses completely. Knight went back to e8, but now after capturing on e6 and knight g5 in the end, Levon resigned, and with Nakamura beating Esipenko, Nakamura was the first in the group, and Oparin second, Levon third. And with this loss, in the end, Levon lost all his chances to qualify via Grand Prix, because he has 10 points from the first round, from the first leg, and also I think 2 points from the second leg, which is in total 12, but it's not enough, because Rapport has 20, and by qualifying, Nakamura has at least 20 as well. So the only chance for him to qualify for candidates is to boost his rating, I think at least to 2790, but at the moment Ding Liren is playing in China a quadruple round robin. I think there are 4 players with but 12 rounds. So that means that they play with each other 4 times. And at the moment, 6 rounds were played, and Ding only has 1 draw and 5 wins, which makes him +8 at the moment. And his current rating is 2808. And Levon lost 8 points in Grand Prix, plus he had the lower rating before this. So now he is live 2765, while Ding is 40 points up. So something terrible has to happen to Ding, let's say to lose a couple of games in China and to drop below 2760, 70. Also, there is, who else? Maybe Wesley So is in competition. Mamedyarov as well. They both qualified for semifinal, and if they win substantial number of games in Classical, they might rise to, let's say, 2790, 2800, and they might challenge Ding for this rating spot. But okay, that's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.